Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Tools for Perseverance series. This is Dr. Jessica Wright. And for the next three of these videos, we're going to talk about trauma and specifically about skills that we can build to help us endure trauma, recover from trauma, better understand trauma, and support each other with all of this. And so I wanted to start with a quote from Dr. Ben Weinstein, who's the chair of psychiatry at Houston Methodist, who says, "We handle things much better when we know that there's an expectation of relief, and right now we don't know, and no one knows." So I think a lot of us can handle, we can endure through difficult times when we understand what the next level is, what's going to happen next. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and we'll talk about how uncertainty is related to trauma coming up. So I thought it was important over the next three sessions, we'll talk about what trauma is and how, what we know about how to persevere when we experience trauma. So let's talk about what trauma is. So trauma is an emotional response to an event that creates a sense of fear and unpredictability and leads us to feel our life is under threat. Let's break this down for a little bit. So I'll start with emotional response. Pop quiz, based on our some of the original emotional intelligence sessions that we did in the Tools for Perseverance. Do you control your emotions? Yes or no? Do you get to control the emotions you experience? If we were in a classroom, I'd have you raise your hands, but the answer to that is no. Emotions are chemical reactions that are produced in our unconscious, and we do not have control of the emotions that we experience. We do have control over how we respond to those emotions, okay? So let's get that sort of built into our mind as our framework for when we're looking at this definition. If trauma is an emotional response to an event, it is a response that we are not consciously controlling. Right? It's not something that we are consciously controlling. It is being controlled by our unconscious, with our brain and our body producing the emotional response, right? Interestingly, it's a response to an event. In the full definition, it's a response to an event or series of events. And I would argue that what we're living through right now are a series of events that continue to unfold on top of each other, which they'll collectively be thought of as a grouping, or maybe they'll be thought of as different points in time. But we have an ongoing event with a bunch of sort of punctuated smaller events that may be what we remember most specifically. So an emotional response to an event. And emotions, again, chemical signals from your brain that you don't control. And they manifest in your brain and your body and your psyche, but as well, they also manifest in your body, right? You have physical response to them. All right, next part says, creates a sense of fear and unpredictability. So the idea of fear, we talked a little bit about anxiety in previous sessions. Anxiety and fear have a lot of similarity, a lot of overlap. And one of the things we know about fear is that it causes our brain to be on high alert, right? Anxiety creates this, it makes you go into that fight, flight, or freeze scenario, right? You've got this anxiety pumping through your body, and that fear is spurred on, it's encouraged, it's made more strong, it's strengthened by unpredictability, right? The situation that we're in now is incredibly unpredictable. We have no ability to see how the decisions that we're making now, we're at the beginning of May when I'm recording this, are going to impact our July, right? We have experts that are putting this content together, and thank God there are a whole segment of people who work in public health that this is their job, this is what they do, who are able to predict certain things. And some of those are getting put into place in terms of policy, and some aren't. And this is a continuously unfolding situation, as well as the biological medicine, right? As we move forward to create different vaccines, as we move forward to create different treatments, as we better understand the disease, and how it's spread, and how, what it looks like on a population. There's a lot of unpredictability, right? And this unpredictability is like it feeds back into that emotional response. And all of this leads us to feel that our life is under threat, that we have a threat to our very life. Now, we'll talk about what scientists, psychologists have identified life meaning, right? So sometimes, in this case, there is a very concrete threat to our mortality, right, that exists. And humans are really bad at predicting how big of a threat, judging, how big of a threat something is to them. And so it's maybe hard to understand, the threat that exists for us. But here's what we know from psychology about what life means. So a loss of our job can be a threat to our life, right? If I don't have income coming my way so that I can pay for things like food and shelter, that can be a threat to my life. If I have a loss of a fundamental belief, which this global pandemic may have shaken or shifted some of our beliefs about how the world works or about how things happen, if that occurs, that's a huge threat to our life, right? A loss of safety, again, direct threat to our mortality. A loss of normalcy, a loss of ability to continue on this way. I read an interesting quote from a physician who works exclusively with people with spinal cord injuries, and they talk about one of the first things that's grieved is the loss of normalcy, normal routine, going through the regular phases of life for an individual that has suffered the trauma of a spinal cord injury. So in a similar way, not in the same way as that acute issue within a single individual who has lost severely the loss of their normal life. We have experienced a loss of normalcy, and that is a threat, that feels like a threat to our life. Now, there's an interesting quote from Dr. Christopher Fagundes at Rice University, who talks about how COVID is, and what we're experiencing as a result of this, is a collection of a lot of different losses, right? We have experienced sort of a constellation of losses that is causing all of this anxiety and having us experience trauma in this way. So one of the issues, Dr. Ben Weinstein from Houston Methodist describes a little bit about why trauma is a problem. So trauma is an issue for us because, and this is his quote, our brain is on high alert and we may perceive a threat when there is not one, right? We learn from experience, and if you've had a terrible experience, you remember it, your body remembers it, and as a result, you may perceive a threat when there is not one. So that's something that individuals that have and that was from Dr. Ben Weinstein, the chair of psychiatry at Houston Methodist. The issue with trauma is that our brains are really good at learning, and if we experience trauma, we learn that this is how it goes, that this is what is happening, that this is what to do, and we need to be looking out for threats. And the issue is our brain may perceive something as a threat that is not really a threat to us. It may perceive a benign circumstance as a threat, right? An easy extrapolation of this or example of this would be an individual who has experienced the horrors of combat and then come home to a place where he or she is safe. If they hear fireworks, it's going to be something that a veteran has they have learned that sound is going to be a threat, right? And they're going to perceive an acute, threat to their survival when they hear the sound of fireworks. And so that's the issue with trauma. That's what trauma can cause. And so we're going to talk about this session and in the next couple of sessions, how we react to trauma, and then how to look for signs that we need to get help with trauma, and different levels of that. So one important component with all of this, Dr. Weinstein points out that sometimes when we experience trauma, it can make us change everything about how we see the world, right? Our entire worldview has now altered. And then other people, when they experience trauma, they have no change, right? It doesn't change how they see the world. Dr. Weinstein says, all of us react differently to major stressors. For one person, something can be very traumatic, and for another person, they won't experience it in the same way. It's difficult to predict whether the same event will trigger trauma in someone. We do know that people who have already experienced previous trauma, people who have experienced death, for example, if you have the death of a loved one, a divorce, abuse, neglect, bullying, people who are in a position of financial instability, or they don't have a strong support system in place, and those of us who have a history of anxiety and depression, or who have a tendency to obsess, right, to be obsessively worrying. These individuals are more likely to experience the same event as other individuals and then experience trauma as a result. Now, again, reiterating, trauma is an emotional response to an event. It is not under our conscious control, right? So let's talk through different responses to trauma. So one of my favorite quotes from all of this has been that just like we have different colored eyes, different hair textures, differently shaped smiles, we also have different brains. And people's biorhythms are different. So some people's reactions to stress are going to be different. That is not a fault. It's not a failure to rise to an occasion, right? So there's a train of thought that is false in this scenario, which is that if individuals experience an event and it affects them as trauma, right? It's not a failing of moral character, right? There is a very it's incorrectly applied in this context. It's also dangerous, this idea that if you experience trauma, that it is and someone else does not, then it means it's your fault and you have a faulty character. That is a complete falsehood. Not only is it not useful in this case, it's also incorrect. It's also not an individual's failure to rise to the occasion. They can't just sort of rally up and then be able to overcome this, right? Because again, it's not produced in our conscious brains. It is produced in our unconsciousness, and it is not what we experience that we control. It's what we do to react to that experience, what we do as a result of that experience. So if I could have this tattooed on different people or if I could have this up on a sticky note in front of a bunch of people so that everyone could see this all the time. Importantly, comparative suffering does not reduce the symptoms of trauma. So what's comparative suffering? Comparative suffering means, I got food poisoning and I'm very sick and I'm throwing up, let's say, and someone says, oh, it's not so bad. At least you are still able to walk around. Or at least there are other people that are sicker than you. That's comparative suffering. I am sick and someone says, well, it's not, or maybe I say it myself, I shouldn't be worrying, I shouldn't be upset about this, it's not as bad as someone else, right? or if I have a difficult financial situation that I'm trying to solve or dig my way out of, someone else saying, well, this person down the street has a harder time financially than you do. That's not useful, right? Comparative suffering does not alleviate the suffering of any individual. It doesn't alleviate the suffering of the person who has a more intense event happening or the person that has a less intense event happening. And because everything is variable and some people experience it differently than others, you cannot judge how much someone is suffering as a result of an event. So we're going to get rid of comparative suffering. We're going to understand that trauma is an emotional reaction and that we all react differently in different situations. So let's talk about a fun, by the way, that idea of that quote, "That's not a fault, that's not a failure to rise to an occasion." Dr. Neil Sarahan, who is the director of the National Alliance of Mental Illness for Greater Houston, this was his quote that he came up with. I really enjoyed it. So let's talk through some more lighthearted examples of how each of us experience the same event differently. So, let's talk about the idea of getting older, perhaps turning 40, turning 50, turning 60, one of those big landmark birthdays, right? How have you seen different reactions to, quote, getting older? These questions are to help us understand that we regularly have different experiences, different reactions to things. So how have you seen different reactions to getting older? And then if you think about a trauma like a death, how have you seen different reactions at a funeral? Now, this could be from television or movies or in your own personal life, right? Not everyone reacts the same way, and there will be different levels of reaction at a funeral, different levels of reaction for turning 40. Someone might have a giant celebratory birthday for turning 50, and someone else might dress all in black and be very somber, and another person might go out and get a brand new convertible or purchase a motorcycle, right? What are the different reactions you've seen to getting older? And then how have you seen different reactions at a funeral? This conversation is going to help us think about how we each react differently to the same event. And that's going to set us up next week. To the next session, we're going to talk through some ways we know that it's time to act about experiencing trauma, and then what actions we can take specifically. So can't wait to hear what you have to say in the chat box.